Tonight's program is the book My Brave Mechanics, the First Michigan Engineers in Their Civil War. I picked up, or actually I get it in the mail, National Geographic this month has an article about the trip of Lincoln's funeral train running from Washington to Springfield, where he's buried in Illinois, running all the way up through Chicago and Buffalo and all over the place. I can't imagine with embalming in those days that for 3 weeks his coffin was open, but nonetheless it was. But I thought a lot about the work that these gentlemen did, the Michigan engineers on those tracks where the train passed. As volunteer engineers of the Union Army, this regiment was made up of skilled artisans, craftsmen, railroad men, and engineers who behind the scenes work was critical to the Union victory. They constructed and repaired a staggering number of bridges, blockhouses, fortifications, railroads, and telegraph lines that kept the Union Army going after the aftermath of battle. The author of this book, our speaker tonight, is Mark Hoffman, who currently serves as the Chief Administrative Officer of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Previously, he was the Deputy Director of the Michigan Department of History, Arts, and Libraries, and also served on the staff of the Michigan Bureau of State Lottery and the Michigan House of Representatives. A lifelong student of the American Civil War, he also wrote Among the Enemy, a Michigan Soldier's Civil War Journal, published in 2013. Both of his Civil War books were published by Wayne State University Press. He's a graduate of Michigan State University with a degree in history. He and his wife Ann, who also graduated from Michigan State, live in Mason near Lansing, and they have 2 adult children, Patrick and Alice, and I'll let you guess where they graduated from. Mark Hoffman, thank you.
Yeah, that might help.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I've spent about the last 30 years or so researching this group of soldiers from Michigan who served in the Civil War, and what amazes me after that time is how much more material I keep coming across. The work they did was so significant and so recognized during their lives and in the years following the war that there's stuff all over the place about the engineers. It helps us understand what role they played that was unique. What I'm hoping tonight, by the time we leave, is I've accomplished a couple missions. One is I hope I've been able to provide a story of their service from organization to muster out at the end of the war, and some of the highlights of their service and the contributions they made. I also hope to step back and look at that bigger picture of this concept of volunteer engineers. You know, we think about CVs and combat engineers routinely as part of our military, as part of our success in war and in conflict, but it really isn't something that just suddenly developed in this century. The roots of combat engineers in today's Army, the roots of the construction battalion, CVs, and so forth, really go back to the days of the Civil War. And the Civil War provides a bit of a dividing line in that regard. Before then, you did have, obviously, engineers in military service. They played a very important role in fortifications and defenses and those kind of things. But it really wasn't recognized as a major component of the success or failure of an army until the Civil War. And the U.S. government never really tapped the rich resources it had in the population. And if you think about our tradition in this country in war, we have a relatively small standing army, bad things happen, we ramp up, recruit, war's over, they go home. And so our success is dependent upon the ability to recruit those soldiers and sailors and airmen now who have skills that they bring with them from the civilian world into our military. And that's really the story tonight with these engineers and mechanics. If you don't mind, I appreciate my
I managed not to bring my remote control. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. First, though, let's talk about this concept of volunteer engineers. In the Civil War, there were about 2.1 million soldiers who served in the Union Army. Only about 25,000 or so could be called engineer troops. And there's different terms they use and different tasks they did, but essentially they were all designed to do engineering work. And that could be building defenses, fixing railroads, doing supply warehouses, could be destroying the other sides, all of the above. That was an important part of what they did too. They also, in many cases in a desperate pinch, operated the railroads. They ran the supply wagon trains. They did really whatever it took to keep an army fed and moved, sometimes under fire and sometimes operating in the rear of the forces. Of those, there were some units, like the Michigan Engineers, that were very purposefully recruited for this. So as Mike alluded to in the introduction, this unit was raised to be military engineers. Their officers were drawn heavily from among railroad men, those who built and had operated railroads, along with the skilled trades, and the same is true of their enlisted men. But there were other units that served during the war at very important times that were converted and trained for this purpose. The Army recognized we needed something special, and we didn't have it among the forces. And an example I offer is an Indiana regiment that was pulled out of duty as an infantry unit and was designated as pontooniers. Now, those are guys who built and moved pontoon bridges, and we'll look at what those looked like at the time of the Civil War. But so important was that work that they were willing to have one less combat infantry regiment in order to help move Sherman's army across Georgia and the Carolinas as it crossed all those rivers that were necessary, and they needed the pontooniers then. Sometimes, too, there were times when you take infantry units, and after a battle at a place called Chickamauga in Georgia, there were 3 Michigan units who suffered terrible losses. And while they were being reorganized and reinforced, they were used as engineer troops to run sawmills and build buildings for supplies in Chattanooga. So it's an example of we didn't have enough to meet that need, and we were willing to take infantry units and rededicate them to that purpose. And they served almost a year as engineer troops. But the ones that I'll focus on tonight, the Michigan engineers, were very specifically raised to serve as engineer troops for that purpose. There really were 4 places in the country where engineer troops were raised in some density. And there's a different story in each, and I won't go into it. But the 4 are New York, Michigan, Illinois, and Missouri. In New York, their militia units had for a decade or more had engineer units attached. Very unusual. So when the war started and Lincoln called for governors to send their militia units to put down the rebellion, those New York guys showed up with platoons or even whole companies of engineer troops. They helped repair the road on the way to a place called Bull Run, where the first battle of the war was fought. On the other side of the country in St. Louis, we had large numbers of Germans who had fled when the democratic revolt in the various German principalities collapsed in the 1840s. And so you had a concentration there of men who'd been trained in the German army to do engineering work. They were very pro-union, and so when the war broke out, they organized engineering units with rank and file even who had been trained as engineer officers in the German tradition, which was considered one of the best of the engineering traditions in the military at the time. Then in Illinois, you have this effort that, well, like a lot of things in Illinois, gets buried in mystery and fraud and missing money and all of that. And so there's an effort to raise a regiment in Chicago, a place called Camp Douglas, right on the outskirts of town. A guy's picked to be in charge of it. He's given money to recruit it. They designate a couple other officers, and then they send out recruiting officers. And they scatter across Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, start signing guys up. And they send these companies into Camp Douglas to organize. Well, the colonel disappears, the money disappears. The lieutenant colonel, the second in command, can see where this is going, so he finds a different regiment, gets a commission as colonel, so he comes up 1 rank higher out of the whole deal. And the governor of Illinois gets tired of hearing reports about these soldiers and their debauchery in the city of Chicago and getting arrested in the fight. So he took all the Illinois soldiers in that camp and sent them to infantry regiments, and the rest of them all just kind of scattered and went home. So it went bust. The good news for our story tonight, though, is that organizational effort and those recruiters had stirred interest in engineering companies in places like Michigan. So there were several companies being raised in Michigan that were to be sent to Illinois, and 1 went, but 4 didn't. And those then were the nucleus upon which the Michigan engineers formed. So the debacle, if you want to call it that, in Chicago was the genesis for the support and success of the engineers being formed in Michigan. Yes, next one, thanks. So they were organized in the fall of 1861, officially designated as engineers and mechanics, but generally referred to as engineers. The officers, as we've said, well trained for engineer work, very little military experience at all in the regiment, but when it came to the engineering part of their job as military engineers, they knew exactly what they were doing. Same thing with the recruits. Now, they were organized and armed as infantry, so each company had about 100 men. They had 10 companies, so about 1,000 together. And they had uniforms that in most respects were similar to infantry, except they had these big, gaudy, regular Army decorative hats that didn't last long in the field. And like most infantry units, they got a mix of good new rifles and lousy old muskets that foreign governments in Europe were selling to the U.S. as fast as they could get rid of them because we were desperate to buy whatever was there. They did, however, have a lot more of engineering equipment. I think of them sometimes as a hardware store on the move because the lists of equipment they had in terms of hoes and shovels and rakes and all of the kind of stuff that you would need to move earth to cut trees, so hatches and axes and woodworking tools that you need to construct buildings were assigned to them, along with infantry firearms, the rifles and muskets. And at one point, they even had a battery of artillery that was to be attached to them, and that didn't happen. But there was one rub that didn't get sorted out back in camp, and that was pay. In the U.S. military history, there's this tradition of paying engineer troops more. The idea being they have some skills that have a greater value. So if you were an infantryman and you were detailed to, say, do blacksmith work because you had that trade that you'd learned, you were paid extra, maybe as much as 25 cents a day. But when you're making 13 bucks a month, 25 cents a day isn't a bad little extra to receive for that. And so from the beginning, these engineering units being formed all across the country were told you'd get paid more. There was questions as to what more meant, because, you know, you'd like to know the detail. And it was always, we'll work it out. Well, we were trying to save the Union. You know, everything we stood for and believed in was at stake. And so the men were willing to kind of trust a bit to the government. They're going to get more, we'll sort the details out. Well, it didn't work so well, as you can well imagine. And so if we'd go to the next one. What happened was the paymasters would come around and offer them infantry pay, because that's what they were told to offer. The men had to make a choice. If they accepted the infantry pay, most of them believed that that would give up the claim they had to the higher pay. Some were desperate and took it. So what you have, and what I try to do tonight is use the words of those in the regiment as much as possible. They were given this dilemma that they had to address, and in many of them they poured this out in letters home. So Private Albert Graves writing to his wife, "I'll send you some money just as soon as I get it, which I hope will be sometime before you start and the land is sold for taxes." Now he wasn't kidding, because the township their farm was in had levied a special millage to raise money to have a fund for destitute soldiers' families who were in financial need. So she couldn't pay the tax to support the fund that would in fact have later supported them, because he hadn't been paid. So they were going to lose the taxes because they couldn't fund the fund that should help them. That's all, like, makes sense, right? Private Calkins writing home, "Our colonel has used fraud and deception ever since our first enlistment, and he's got caught at it. The colonel never had any orders to get up any such regiment as we are. Thank fortune we have him on the fence, and we calculate to keep him there." They blamed the officers in many cases, and so for the first 6 months, there were charges back and forth between the officers and the men. And this was true not just in Michigan. At one point, the colonel of the New York regiment put a loaded revolver to the head of one of the soldiers who refused to work without pay and said, "Work or die." And the soldier used a profane turn back. He pulled the trigger. The gun was empty. The soldier just about fainted, you can well imagine, and the colonel got in trouble and was punished for it. That's how bad relations got between officers and men, and it happened for a whole year. It wasn't until November of 1862 that most of these men were offered and received engineering pay. And that's significant, because we're going to talk about some pretty amazing work they did for the first year. And during that whole time, they weren't getting paid. There was this deep chasm that formed in most cases between the officers and the men. And so you had this bitterness underneath it all, yet every day they generally got up and did the work that they were assigned and that we need them to do. Now, in the end, there was an investigation. Ennis was cleared. The conclusion was, and there was a lot of evidence of it, that he was acting in good faith. He'd received promises from the War Department in Washington that they would receive higher pay, that he had been doing everything on behalf of the soldiers, working with the Michigan congressional delegation and others to try to get it passed. So of course, Ennis, who had a little bit of problems sometimes in how he addressed people, he was a better engineer than people person, if you know what I mean here, decided to send the letter back to newspapers after he was cleared. And he used this phrase, and it's typical of the phrases he used in the letter: "Abuse has been heaped upon my head by low, vile, cowardly rascals." Pretty strong stuff. He was talking about a U.S. Senator and 2 members of Congress at the time, so it didn't help his chances. And when people always ask, "Well, why was he never a general?" I said, "Well, you know, this phrase might not have got." But anyway, he was a good engineer. We'll leave it at that. He had to move forward things. In December 1861, the engineers were sent to Kentucky, and they joined an army commanded by a Union general named Buell. Kentucky, let's step back for a second. Kentucky was a slave state that did not succeed. It was a divided state, though, and so soldiers from Kentucky served in armies both north and south. The Union wanted to take Kentucky and then continue on into Tennessee, which had seceded and was a very important state for the Confederacy. The Confederates knew that if they could keep the Union up in Kentucky, they could protect Tennessee and kind of that breadbasket. And Nashville was also a very important industrial point. So the Union armies were forming across the middle of Kentucky. Confederate forces lined up right against them all across the state from west to east. So the engineers were split up, and this was going to be the case with them for most of their service. They very seldom were all together as one regiment. They were so valuable, they were parceled out, helped different commands and different columns move forward. 3 of them ended up supporting Union divisions that were along that main railroad, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, repairing bridges and roads and camps. But one was sent over to the right. You'll see Lebanon, Kentucky, to the east there, and the 4 stars I'm referring to. And that division had been sent out there to keep an eye on Confederates in eastern Kentucky, to make sure they didn't kind of come around the side. And that general, a guy named Thomas, who later became pretty famous, decided to send a smaller group of men forward to keep an eye on Confederates further south. Well, after a while, they realized putting these guys out there was like, putting bait on a track for mice. They're coming for them. There's a small group, and they're going to get captured. Confederates, of course, knew that and were already organizing troops to do that. So you had a race, and this was really the first time that you were able to see the benefit of having trained engineer troops with your column. So on the one side, you've got there in Lebanon, and where that star is, a division of Union troops racing down toward where the circle is on the Cumberland River. South of that river, you have Confederates trying to get their army together across the river and then fall on top of and capture this Union force. And they almost pulled it off. When they attacked in the morning, they found to their surprise that the Union troops had been reinforced the night before. The Confederates were outnumbered, they were defeated in the battle, and they were thrown back across the river. The reason the Union won the Battle of Mill Springs, it's called, sometimes it's also called Fishing Creek or Logan's Crossroads, was because the Union troops got there in the nick of time. And that Union column got there because they had 3 companies of Michigan engineers with them. Their job was to help get them to that point. And I always talk about Kentucky in January is kind of like Michigan in March. You get sun, snow, sleet, rain, usually all on the same day, right? So you got freeze, you got thaw, you've got roads here out in the country that were made for country wagons, not for heavy artillery pieces. Confederates destroyed bridges, you had mud, morass, ice, all of that problem, making it complicated to move an army. And that's my description. If you hit the next slide, let's hear it in the words of someone who was there. This is Captain James Slide. He was a militia commander and merchant from Grand Rapids, one of the original organizers of the regiment. In a letter to his wife Eliza, the people at home are sometimes complaining of the slow movements of the army. I wish some of them had been with us for the last week, and then they would have had their eyes opened a little. The roads are certainly the worst I ever saw. The wagons would mire up to their hubs, and then we would have to them out. We had to cut new roads nearly half the way from Columbia. Sometimes we would have to take the horses from the wagons and draw them out by man force. We made about 2 miles a day. That's kind of a slow pace, but it was enough because they were able to get there in time to reinforce that Union command and see victory. Mill Springs was also important because it was the first time they came face to face with war. The engineers weren't in the battle, but they were assigned to gather up the dead, bury them, and guard the Confederate prisoners. Here's what Private King wrote home describing this. It was the most sickening sight I have ever seen, all bloody and some with legs and arms shot off. Mill Springs was a fairly small battle by any definition during the war, but for these guys it was that first one, and it was the one that was memorable. And later in the war, you often see in their letters them referring back to the carnage at Mill Springs as still present in their mind, even though they had been in those greater battles. So Union won Mill Springs, and then the Union won some battles in western Kentucky, and so the Confederates fell back. So if you don't mind, we moved further south. And just to orient ourselves, this is a map we're going to see a couple of times tonight, and this is the area where the engineers spent the bulk of their time. So up to the north, the top center, we have Nashville. Nashville was capital of Tennessee, so it was the first state capital to follow the Union forces. It was a major industrial city, something people generally don't realize. It was also in that central mid-Tennessee, which was an agricultural important region. Great crops, and then also for livestock, a lot of mule production in particular, and horse production. Now, the most important part of this is a triangle. So if you start in Nashville, and you go southwest to Decatur, Alabama, that's one part of the triangle. And then if you go back to Nashville and go southeast to Stevenson, and then Bridgeport over to Tennessee, and then that eventually goes to Chattanooga. That's another part of that triangle. And the base of the triangle is the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, running, in this case, from Decatur to Stevenson. That triangle was an essential supply route for Union forces for the next 2 years. When Sherman took Atlanta, it was because of supplies that were moved along here. When Union troops won at Chattanooga and drove the Confederates off of Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain, it was because of supplies that moved on that route and so forth. So the engineers got to know every single bridge, every single town, all up and down that triangle road. And so in March of 1862, you had the engineers and mechanics and all of Buell's army in the general area of Nashville. And then if you flip to the next, folks start moving. So over in the west, Pittsburgh Landing, near a place called Shiloh, that you've heard of if you're followed the Civil War, you had Grant with an army of Union soldiers there. And Buell took most of his troops from Nashville and marched them across country to join with Grant. And then they were going to move on this Corinth, which is circled on the left. And Corinth's important because it's on that railroad. And that railroad line, the Memphis and Charleston, runs from the Mississippi to the East Coast. So it's a very important supply line for the Confederates. They left behind a small force of troops and 2 companies of the engineers in Nashville. The general there, a guy named Ormsby Mitchell, who was a very famous astronomer, a better astronomer than general, as it turns out, but he decided that the best defense is a good offense. So he, instead of staying in Nashville, took his troops all the way down to Huntsville, Alabama, marched them down the road, and managed to capture the place, surprising the Confederates, surprising his commanders too, who had no idea he was going to Huntsville with his command. Huntsville's important because it's on that railroad, the base of the triangle we talked about. Because back in 1862, in the South, their railroads are often of different gauges. And so if you're transferring and going across one rail line to another, you would have to stop, unload, move it by wagon usually, and then reload it on the cars of another line. If sometimes you had a break in the line, and you would have to put them on a steamboat or other water transportation, and then move them and reload them. The Memphis and Charleston was that only line still left for the Confederates running east-west. So it's their ability to move, say, cattle from Texas or troops from Georgia back and forth across there to the various fronts where the Union was threatening. So all of a sudden, this guy Mitchell, assigned to stay near Nashville, shows up in Alabama, lands square in Huntsville, and manages to cut this line completely, leaving the Confederates in lurch, because now they have to go on different lines running all the way to the south, over and then back up, to be able to continue their journey. Now the important thing for Mitchell was that he had those 2 companies of the engineers, because their railroad, the Memphis and Charleston, the base of the triangle we talked about, was intact. Because he surprised the Confederates, they didn't have time to destroy anything. And he captured the railroad cars and he captured the engines. So he had a little mini railroad all to himself pretty much. But he didn't have anybody to run it because the civilian employees of the line were pro-Southern, pro-Confederate, and they hauled out with the Confederate troops. But he had those 2 companies, and those men in particular in the engineers were individuals who were very well trained in railroads. The senior captain, Captain John Yates, of Company A, who was in charge of those 2 companies, had helped run the Michigan Central Railroad from his base in Albion. He was a highly trained engineer, civil engineer, and railroad operator in a very involved in operations. So he had 2 companies of men, he had a collection of engines and cars, he had intact track, and so he could run Mitchell's men back and forth along the base of the triangle wherever they were threatened. He could move supplies that came down that road from Huntsville back and forth. Now, you're the Confederates, most of your troops aren't there because they've all been sent over to Corinth, because that's where everybody else is. But you've got some cavalry, and you've got some civilians in the area who are supporting the Confederacy and become bushwhackers. So what do you go after? Mitchell strings, right? You go after the railroad. Well, of course, think about railroads back then. They're single track, 2-way traffic, so you need 2 things for this to work out. You need sidings, so that the trains can pull off and cars and trains pass in the other direction. And you need the telegraph to be able to send messages back and forth and to be able to control that traffic. And that's how railroads were operated then. So what do you go after if you're the Confederates? You go after telegraph. You know how easy it is to take down a telegraph pole and tear up some wire, right? So the engineers spent a lot of time putting telegraph lines back up, and then back up again, and then back up again. They rebuilt many of the same ones. And if you're a Confederate, you fire on the trains as they're going by. You try to burn the bridges and disrupt that, right? So there are things you can try to do to stop Mitchell from being able to move his troops. Well, what's going to happen if you're the Michigan engineers and you're running along the railroad and you're repairing those things and you're doing the telegraph lines and the Confederates are doing the opposite to stop you? There's going to be fighting. And so this was really the first time for the engineers where they engaged in the kind of battle they spent most of their war. And that's these small combats between half a dozen guys out fixing this or repairing that or scouting this, and a group of Confederate cavalry or Confederate bushwhackers, local civilians who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. And it's a very ugly, bitter war that happens as this goes on. So if you'd flip, please. Here's a Private Kimball's account of one. We were to set up our camp in the forenoon and begin work on the bridge in the afternoon. Some of the men strayed off, and 2 of Company E's men went to the river, where they were fired upon by bushwhackers from the opposite side. One was killed on the spot and the other wounded, but he reached camp and gave the alarm. And this went on and on. Telegraph parties were attacked. Bridge building parties were attacked. Now Mitchell, who was supposed to, you remember, be in Nashville and now is in Huntsville in northern Alabama, kept sending these glowing reports back to Washington. Everything's fine, I got it under control, don't worry. But even he had to admit, when things got as bad, that things were spinning out of control in terms of his ability to manage things there. And he sent a report that armed citizens firing the trains, that cut the telegraph wires, attacked the guards of bridges, and cut off and destroyed my couriers. Many of those couriers were engineers and mechanics because they were running along those telegraph lines, often with the parties. And so you see the engineers smack dab in the middle of this war between Mitchell and Confederate cavalry and Confederate bushwhackers. If you'd flip forward, thanks. Now it all kind of came to a head in a way, and it wasn't the last by any means episode, but it was the one that got the most attention, and that happened at Limestone Creek. The Union troops were in Athens, Alabama, and they were attacked by Confederate cavalry and local civilians, and they were outnumbered, and so they were loading up as much equipment as they could save, and they were retreating out of there. And so in loading these trains, they would load them and send them, load them and send them, desperation. You can see how this would go. And so these trains were going out by themselves. The only guards on them were small groups of infantry or Michigan engineers. So in one instance, one of them ran into problems at a bridge. And I'll turn it over to William Clark. He was a soldier from Olivet, Michigan. In less than 2 years, a bridge we had twice crossed was burned by a party of rebel soldiers and citizens. Our train crossed after it was on fire. Another train on which were several of the Albion boys attempted to do the same by putting on all steam, but it was too late. The bridge fell and the locomotive timber and some cars went down. One of the Albion boys escaped with only a scratch or two. One was wounded, his arm and scalded. One had a leg broken just below the knee. And another was caught in the ruins and could not be extricated until he was suffocated by the flames and smoke, while appealing piteously to be got out or shot dead at once. Another account suggests that there were those Union soldiers who offered to run into the fire to pull out Thomas Jenkinson from Albion, who was the man there. And what they were told was, let the damned Yankee die. That was important not just for the regiment, but also this is a story that very quickly circulated among Union troops and was cited by many as a reason why they had to get tough with rebels. Here's how one officer described it in the regiment. He sent this home for publication in the Flint Wolverine Citizen. My feelings in regard to the conduct of this war have very much changed since I've been in the South, especially of late. When I have seen hardships our army has to endure and the cruelties inflicted on these soldiers by these miserable traitors in the South, wolves in sheep's clothing, I have made up my mind that our government has got to take off its kid gloves if it intends to squash this rebellion. And you start to see things like an eye for an eye, a noose is too good. Those kind of phrases start showing up here. There's a bitterness. Now, some of this came to a head not long after Limestone Creek. The Union troops came back to Athens, and their colonel, who was in command of the unit, a guy named Turchin, said, I'm going to turn my eyes, or close my eyes, he counts very, for 2 hours, and they completely sacked the town. There were some who criticized Turchin. Lincoln promoted him to brigadier general, and he continued on in the military. Things had gotten that bad less than a year after forces had taken the field, and not much more than even a year after the start of the war. And the engineers were in the middle of all of this in northern Alabama. If you'd turn, please. Now, the Confederates evacuated Corinth. We talked about that as that rail town. And then they moved their army all the way around to Chattanooga, and then up along the mountains and into Kentucky. So they did this complete big right hook around Union troops. And so those forces that were in northern Alabama had to retreat back because they were going to be cut off. And the Union forces retreated all the way to Louisville. So they went from Huntsville, Alabama, down there in the Tennessee River, all the way up to Louisville, almost to Ohio, reorganized, regrouped, and then came out fighting. And so at a little town called Perryville in eastern Kentucky, you had the battle between those Union columns coming out of Louisville, reinforced and reorganized, and the Confederate troops that had invaded north into Kentucky. And of course, the engineers and mechanics were heavily involved in that. There were 3 columns of Union troops that were moving on separate routes to try to confuse the Confederates. And the engineers were in the front of each, helping to clear the roads. When they got to Perryville, the Union left flank was attacked by Confederates and was surprised in the attack. And the engineers and mechanics were in the middle of that, a 3-company group. So if you turn that, please. And we won't get into this, this regiment did this and then pivoted here and all that, but essentially what happened is the Union left flank got driven back, and as it retreated, it gathered each line. They would try to slow down the Confederates and slow them down and then back up some more and slow them down. Because they were trying to get reinforcements from the other part of the Union forces on the field. The engineers, 3 companies under a guy named Major Hopkins, were in charge of protecting some of the artillery batteries for the Union that were very important. But it got so desperate at the end, they were grabbing everybody they could to send into the breach to try to hold just long because darkness was coming. And generally Civil War battles didn't continue after dark because you'd too easily get confused and be firing on your own troops and everything else. So in the desperation, they grabbed the 3 companies of engineers, told Hopkins to take him into the fight, and he let his boys in, supposedly declaring, "Now my brave mechanics, if you work, you can fight, follow me." I don't know if he said it, but it made for the title of a book, so I always like to And they went into battle, about 150 of them. About 50 of them were brand new and had probably never fired their muskets. They were recruits that had been joined recently from Hastings for the most part. And of those 150, about 10% didn't come out. There's a confusion about battles. We hear about Gettysburg, the fighting and all of that. What isn't often talked about is what it's like after the battle that night. And so this was a confusing situation. Union Army had been pushed back. The engineers had been pushed back when the Union line collapsed there at the end. So I'm going to let William Horton describe it if you would. Next slide, please. We started to look for water, being very thirsty and tired. We were fired upon once by some unknown person, but were too tired to make any effort to find out. At last we came to a mud hole with soldiers as thick as bees around a hive, and so thick was the mud and water that we sucked the water between our teeth. We concluded to lie down near the spring, but as the rebels had driven us back and got our blankets, we had no covering, and it was very chilly. We occupied the greater part of the night telling our experience and who we saw wounded or killed. The stock of my gun received a rebel ball that otherwise could have hit me. So we've seen the engineers help to get Thomas's force to Mill Springs, to act as that traditional role of pioneer soldiers, clearing the road ahead. You've seen them in northern Alabama, running captured railroads, providing vital services to repair rail lines and telegraph, and now we see them thrown into battle. So those are 3 of the first instances in which they had to play this role of combat engineers that interchangeably pick up the tool or pick up the musket and into the fray. So if you turn that, please. Now, after the fighting at Perryville, the Confederates fell back to Murfreesboro, Middle Tennessee. Union troops went back to Nashville. They stared at each other for a little while. And then the Union troops came out of Nashville down along the railroad toward Murfreesboro. Confederates once again got a jump on them, this time on the other flank, and almost drove them back across their line of supply. Rosecrans, a guy named Williams Rosecrans, who's now the commander of the Union Army, was desperate to keep open the road between Nashville and Murfreesboro because they had wagon trains bringing the ammunition from Nashville down to the fight and then taking wounded men back to Nashville to try to get them helping out of the way. And in the middle of that's a little town called Laverne. So he took whatever units he had in the rear, cavalry, some detached infantry, the engineers, and sent them to hold Laverne and to try to protect the wagon trains from moving up and down the road. The Confederate cavalry found them. They were isolated. They put their wagons in a circle and taken some cedar brush to try to provide a little bit more cover. The Confederates thought it was just some teamsters from those wagon trains, and so they charged and were thrown back, and charged again and were thrown back. And so for several hours, the Michigan engineers managed to hold off a considerably larger Confederate force that also had artillery. And since Stone's River was a near disaster for the Union Army, this battle at Laverne becomes very significant. It was a Union victory, one of the few times Union troops had stood up to Confederate cavalry at that point in the war and fought them back. And for the engineers and mechanics, it really was a turning point in a couple of ways. First of all, that pay issue had finally been resolved, but not before 100 of the men had mutinied. So at the time they're fighting Laverne, Ennis has 100 of his men back in jail in Nashville for having refused to move with the Army. And so you've got this stain that's attached to his reputation because they were troublemakers all the time. They were always causing problems, this regiment. Even though they did good work at times, they were kind of a pain because they're always complaining about pay and all that kind of stuff. You had a question as to whether Ennis had the loyalty of his men, whether they'd stick with him, and they answered those things at Laverne. It became the battle that was most associated with it. So if you look at the Detroit papers of the day, you'll see fighting at Stone's River, big victory at Laverne, as if they're somehow comparable in the two. This handful of 400 Union soldiers and a couple thousand maybe Confederates. But that continues forward. So if you flip to the next slide. This is the official account of the battle in Michigan in the war, which is the Adjutant General's official story of Michigan's contribution to the war. The rebel horde, exasperated at the successful resistance of the little force, dashed their horses against the circular brush fence, which was only breast high, with infuriated shouts and curses. The Michigan troops were cool and determined. They loaded fast and aimed well. As the troopers rushed on upon all sides, they were met with staggering volleys, almost at the muzzle of the muskets. Horses and riders recoiled again and again until they despaired and soon swept away through the dense forest. Obviously, it's a bit of a hyped-up, exaggerated account. The engineers and mechanics lost a dozen guys. The Confederate cavalry, somewhere maybe 50 or 75. But what was important about it wasn't the casualty toll, but the fact that they'd stood and fought and refused to surrender when they were attacked by superior forces, including artillery. And so after Laverne, nobody questioned this regiment's integrity as a unit. Nobody questioned Ennis's ability to command it. And nobody questioned their willingness to take up a gun and stand in line of battle, just like infantry. So if you go forward one. Now, after the battle at Murfreesboro and that fight at Laverne, the Union troops settled in around Murfreesboro and the Confederates further south on that same railroad. And for several months, the engineers were involved in constructing the largest fortifications ever built in North America, and that's Fortress Rosecrans outside of Murfreesboro. The idea was that it would be large enough to have more than 10 million rations stored there. So that's 10 million days worth of food for soldiers. That was going to be large enough for 50,000 men to camp and man the defenses of this place. Rosecrans was trying to make certain that if you ever got defeated, you had a place to run back to. It never was seriously challenged in the course of the war, but was one of the largest construction projects. So this is a new role for the engineers. This is a traditional military engineer role of building defensive works, and they were very involved in it. They also got into a bit of an argument with the regular army. We talked about the regular army had engineering components and that Corps of Engineer officers. And there were some of them who looked down on these volunteer engineers, these ideas that railroad men could be military officers and do military work. And so when Colonel Ennis went to Washington to sort out some different things, they made a play at taking over this regiment, incorporating it into what was called the Pioneer Brigade, which was run by the regular Corps of Engineers. So if you just flip, and we'll turn to the men again. Lieutenant White, I think that when the colonel returns, there will be a change in the program. And then what Private Isaac Roseberry and others refer to as the bogus brigade business, because they tried to force the Michigan soldiers to be part of this other unit. It didn't happen. Ennis came back, Rosecrans stopped. The reason I mention it is because one of the most famous projects the engineers worked on that you'll see, they completed in record time in direct competition with the Pioneer Brigade, who they hated because of this incident. So if you'd flip forward. And that's the Tullahoma campaign. So the Union troops that had been in Murfreesboro were able to use some of the mountain passes to drive the Confederates out of Tennessee and back across the Tennessee River in northern Alabama again. And then eventually the Confederates retreated all the way to Chattanooga. And so the Union forces moved down, and then they're right back in Stevenson again along the Tennessee River. But they got a problem. Their army's there, but their supply base is in Nashville. And when the Confederates retreated, they destroyed the bridges along the railroad. They did a good job destroying that track when they retreated. And then, even if they get supplies on a restored railroad line, they still have to get across Bridgeport, and the Tennessee is a mile wide at that point. That's a pretty big river to cross. So there's two major projects the engineers are involved in. And for a lot of the rest of the story here, we'll be able to look at photographs of their work because it's well documented. So if you'd flip to the next one. Okay, this is the Elk River Bridge. This is the Nashville and Chattanooga. Had a chance to look at this crossing just a couple months ago, and you can still visualize the topography of the land, though it's built up as you'd expect around it. I like to use this photograph, though, for a couple of reasons. One, it's one of the most famous projects they worked on. It's about 460 feet long, about 50 feet high. But it also illustrates the kind of bridges they built. Now, remember the TV show MASH? They weren't doing final surgery. Their idea was to stabilize, to do trauma kind of surgery, to patch people up, and then to send them back to most of the hospitals in Tokyo. They could do the long-term medical recovery work. And a lot of times when the engineers were working on military bridges, that was the goal here. These weren't structures over the last 5 years. These were things that could be built quick with materials in the area, and then civilian contracted crews would come along behind and build more lasting structures. This is called the Trestle Bridge. And basically, and I've circled a trestle by way of illustration. Essentially what you do is you take 4 tree trunks, because these are generally built lumber in the round. Don't worry about sawmills here. And they're perpendicular, they're vertical. And then you put them in a slight triangle, as you can see, and you connect them with braces across the horizontal. And then you have a series of those across, and then the caps are connected. The weakness of these is that they're sitting in the bed of the creek, and there's no piers generally. They had a couple here, or 3 they worked with that were masonry, but sooner or later they're going to wash out. And we'll see in a minute a different kind of bridge that isn't as vulnerable to that. But what was important about this is it was built from standing lumber right there on site. So all they needed to do was be able to cut down the tree, strip it, cut it to length, and then they would build the bents, and then they would lift these bents together through blocking and tackle. And so they would put up one and hold it, and then they'd put up another and connect it, and they'd keep going like that. And obviously sometimes it falls. I mean, this isn't always the way according to plan, right? Just like everything else. But they were able to build this thing in less than a week. Now what had happened was the pioneers started work on this, but Rosecrans was getting pretty frustrated. His guys were going to get hungry there at Stevenson if they didn't get this thing fixed pretty quick, and everything was going to come to a grinding halt. Washington was shouting at him, Lincoln and the War Department, keep going, get the Confederates, go get Chattanooga, see if you can go all the way to Atlanta and so forth. So he was under a lot of pressure to move forward, so he needed this built fast. The pioneers were taking too long. So he went to the pioneers and said, okay, what's it going to take for you guys to get this thing built? This is vital. And they said, if you give us the engineers from Michigan, then we can get this built in 2 weeks, but they have to become part of us, so we've got the extra labor. Ennis, knowing he had some healthy tension between these guys, said to the Michigan engineers, okay, what can you do? And they said, if you get rid of the pioneers and get them out of our way, we can build this thing in a week. And they were successful. And it was a huge, that competition between the two was very important at Elk River, and it's something we see that turns up again over the next year from time to time. So that's one kind of bridge. Now this shows 2 different other kinds. The top one is a truss bridge, and you'll notice it only relies upon, in this case, masonry piers. This is the Tennessee River. And this Tennessee River is split by an island at this point in Bridgeport. So you've got one, and then on the other side of the island, you've got another one that's about the same length. In this case, the railroad bridge had been destroyed on the 2 ends on one end by Confederates and on one by Union troops back when Mitchell was in North Alabama. But it's a much stronger lasting structure. If it's made of wood, though, it requires sawmill, because that is not timber in the round. And then later, of course, they used iron, and there were some iron bridges like this in the north before the war. At the bottom is, well, it's a Rube Goldberg bridge, I guess. It's not a scientific term, but essentially what happened is the primary means of crossing a major river quickly was a pontoon bridge, and we'll see a complete one. At this point, they didn't have enough pontoons to go all the way across. So they, in the shallower part, you'll see they simply drove small timbers in at an angle, piles in a sense, and connected them and then put the bed of the road on it. This was built for General Sheridan, so you don't see him, but he's probably standing up on the hill screaming at these guys and swearing at them to get them moving fast, because that's kind of how he did things. But that bridge was able, as finished by the engineers, and this is September 1st or 2nd, 1863, was able to move artillery, horses as long as you got off and walked them and didn't let them go in cadence. That's the vulnerable point of a pontoon. And then infantry divisions could cross. And so the nice thing then is when everybody was across, you could pick up those boats you'd used, put them on wagons on the other side, and take them to the next place. So it was a portable bridge. In a way, it's kind of the predecessor of the Bailey bridges you may have seen from World War II, when the engineers would bring in and drop sections of bridge as they were crossing rivers in Europe. So in the bottom, you have an improvised partial pontoon bridge, partial Rube Goldberg bridge, and then on the top, you've got the truss. So if you go forward. Now, so that's successful. Sheridan and the other divisions get across, they keep on going, and the Confederates leave Chattanooga and they head south of there. And so you've been to Chattanooga, right? If nothing else on the way to Florida, you've gone by there, you've seen Lookout Mountain, Mission Ridge, and all that. You've got all this high ground that surrounds Chattanooga. And so the Union troops took Chattanooga, went down into Georgia, and then they got defeated at a place called Chickamauga and had to run all the way back to Chattanooga. And they were trapped, and if you go to the next one. The problem with Chattanooga is it's surrounded by all that high ground, and the Confederates were on the high ground, and the supply lines ran along the river at the base of those mountains. So even though the Union troops weren't completely surrounded, they essentially were locked out of being able to get any supplies. To the north, across the river, that's mountains, that's Walden's Ridge. And if you tried to take your wagon trains up there, the horses are going to need to carry as much forage as they can carry in the wagons, because there's no forage for days. And so the only way that they were going to be able to get supplies into the troops in Chattanooga was to be able to break through on the supply line. And they did it at a place called Brown's Ferry. And what happened was they called on, fortunately, and I guess you knew this is coming, right? Who was there at Chattanooga to help out the Union Army?
Michigan engineers.
The Michigan engineers. Yeah, they had 3 companies of engineers. They'd actually been dropped off in Chattanooga to do some bridge repair. Then were put in charge of building caskets after the battle, and somebody said, we need them doing something other than building caskets. We got to figure a way to feed. Because by then, Union troops were down to quarter rations because they were running out. So there were two mills, 2 sawmills that had been left largely intact by the Confederates. The engineers ran the sawmills and designed and built pontoon boats that could be loaded with Union troops, which is that blue squiggly line down the river. So late at night, they put a special group of Union soldiers together in the boats. They floated them downstream the river till they came to Brown's Ferry. And on Brown's Ferry, on the west side, the left, you had Confederates. So they stormed ashore, drove away the Confederates. It was a relatively small group that was half asleep, because why would anybody show up at Brown's Ferry right out in the middle of the north? And then they went back across to that Moccasin Bend Peninsula, loaded up again with troops, took some more, and then they went back and loaded up with the pontoon bridge parts, and the Michigan engineers built a bridge across there. It was called the Michigan Bridge. It was the bridge at Brown's Ferry that essentially saved the 40,000 men in the Army of the Cumberland. Without being able to break this, they would have starved to death. Because even though there were Union troops being rushed as fast as possible to get here to help them, and guys like Grant and Sherman were being sent in to help, they needed to buy time, at least a month, until all those reinforcements could get there. So we've seen the engineers clear the roads to get into Mill Springs. We've seen them operate railroads. We've seen them build the pontoon bridges across the Tennessee, repair the Elk River. And each of those times, the fate of a Union Army and the success in the campaign depended on it. In this case, you had 45,000 guys who would have gone to a Confederate prison if they hadn't figured out a way to pull this off. So if you go forward. Now this is a pontoon bridge across the Tennessee River. It's not the one at Brown's Ferry. I've never been able to find a photograph of it. It was actually dismantled a couple weeks later because they didn't need it. And they used it in later stretch of the Tennessee River. But this is what they look like. And I always talk about a pontoon. You know, we think pontoon now is a party barge or something to take out fishing or something like. But back then, it's kind of like a rowboat on steroids. It's big enough you can put 20 men in some of them, so it's pretty substantial. It's very shallow draft. It has a blunt bow. And the idea is to be able to place them in the river so that, as you can see, they're pointing upstream in this case. And then you connect them with that flat roadbed, which is basically just sawn timber. And all of this can be loaded on wagons and carried with you. So the last guys across start dismantling it as they go, the engineers or other pontoon-trained troops. And then you're off to the next river, and so it's a portable bridge. They didn't design this for the first time during the Civil War. They didn't invent this, but this was the first time they used them large scale. There were some bridge crossings of 1,500 feet with pontoon in Virginia. Previous to this, in Europe, they tried other things like canvas boats and India rubber, which is a kind of rubber, because they didn't have the standing force that we do in this continent. But everywhere you went, any parts you needed, you could assemble out of standing trees if you broke some parts or you needed additional ones. So that's a good image of a pontoon bridge and was typical of the ones that were used at Brown's Ferry and used to move Sherman's army across some of the bigger rivers in the Carolinas. So if you go forward. And it had a huge impact. And here's one of the guys who was on quarter rations and starving, Lieutenant Colonel Kimberly, the 41st Ohio. Well, the depression which had lasted from the days at Chickamauga was gone. The troops felt as if they had been in prison and now were free. There was that sense that we're going to make it after all. And then Union reinforcements got there, they drove away the Confederates, and then next thing you know, it's spring '64, and Grant goes east, and Sherman's preparing to go to Atlanta. At this time, though, there was this battle all the way back to Nashville, as Union troops were moving down the Nashville and Chattanooga and supplies were. And whenever you have that kind of fighting, just like in North Alabama, you're going to see the engineers in the middle of it. They're going to get hurt and they're going to get killed. Here's an account by William Kimball of the death of an officer. Some guerrillas tore up the track 4 miles from camp and ran off the train. Captain Sly was on board and he had both legs crushed from the effects of which he died. This is Captain Sly who gave us that account of moving the Union command to Mill Springs, left behind his wife Eliza in Grand Rapids, left behind 3 young children, and a teenage son who was with the regiment we'll hear from later. And you had lots of folks like Captain Sly who died in the war. He in particular was very significant. He's the only officer to die in the war. He was one of the organizers of the regiment, very well known in the community. The Sly Furniture Company was started by his son, the Sly Clock Company, by the great-grandson, a name you might know from West Michigan. If you'd flip one more, here's a picture of Captain Sly. We always talk about him in casualty reports. I like to look at their pictures sometimes because they then assume a human form to us. This is what the paper had to say. In the death of Captain Sly, his company has lost a good officer. the government a good and loyal defender, our city a good and esteemed citizen, a worthy woman, a beloved husband, and several children, exemplary and indulgent father. May the turf be ever green over the grave of the fallen patriot. Kind of nice stuff. I hope maybe someone says at least half that much nice about me when I'm gone. But the real moving poetry in my mind in the primary source there, his spirit took its flight. He was a diary. He kept a diary and was very faithful about it until the accident when he was in the sabotage track. And he tried to write a few days in this hospitalization. You see it. This diary is among the slide papers at the Bentley down in Ann Arbor. And the day he died, in a very feminine hand, you see that phrase, his spirit took its flight. It was his wife, Eliza, finishing his diary for him. Forward, please. One of the things that the Union tried to do in order to expand the amount of supplies getting to Nashville was to build a new railroad leading there. Before the war, there had been efforts to connect the Tennessee River and Nashville, what was called the Nashville Northwestern Railroad. And it had been scoped out, there had been some work done, and there had actually been some track built, but it was incomplete. So the Union Command needed to have a group of experienced railroad builders take charge of this project, and so they sent Captain, now Major Yates, and some of the other officers from the engineers, and several companies to go work on that railroad. And I wanted to include that because this is when they had time to build bridges a little more lasting. They weren't under pressure. There wasn't an army waiting for them to build it. So if you flip to the next slide, this is an example. Again, this is a trestle bridge, a trestle design that we've seen, but you can see that that's cut lumber. And so they had the luxury of time and the ability of using sawmills in the area to construct these to last. Some of these were over 1,000 feet long. They generally didn't cross rivers. This is a very hilly area, and so they built a lot of this in order to reduce the grade that the trains were going to have to go up and down. Whenever you have to slow down a train in order to get up the hill, what always happens in the movies? That's when the bad guys attack, right? Because the train's going so slow, right? So you don't want to do that. And so they built one after another of these things on some 50 miles of track. If you flip to the next example. So there's another example. One of these goes on about 1,800 feet long of this trestle work. Now, when the modern track, I was following this a couple months ago, and they've gone in and just done fill, and they did that, 50 years ago, so you don't have all this bridging, but it's pretty amazing the work they were able to do. The engineers did most of the work on the bridges. Most of the dirt and a lot of the cutting of trees was done by former slaves, runaway slaves, who had been organized in Nashville and were enlisted in what were called the U.S. Colored Troops. And there were two regiments in particular that the engineers helped train in military drill, and then they worked alongside them for almost a year here. Next one, please. Now, the other thing that was done in order to help defend the railroads was to build blockhouses at every single important point. So every bridge, some of the key places where Confederates had attacked a lot. And this, I like to include these because they illustrate just how serious the Union engineering effort had gotten by this point. It wasn't sending guys and say, go build a blockhouse. They did trials for 3 months on blockhouse design. They shot them up with cannon, they shot rifles at them, everything to see what was the best style. They practiced how quickly they could build them, what kind of tools they needed to have, and how many men it would take. And then they went out and did blueprints, and then they printed sets of these. And so they'd take a blueprint and they'd come to you and say, okay, you and your squad, we're going to drop you off here, you build this. And here's the tools you've got, and the tool list, and here's the materials. It's kind of like you got everything you need in order to be able to do it. That's how organized this thing had gotten by 1864. And so all the way along that railroad from Nashville down to Decatur, across to Memphis and Charleston, and then from Nashville again to the Tennessee, it seems, and on into Chattanooga, and then down into Georgia as Sherman moved to Atlanta. They kept building right behind him to do this. There was not a single instance in which Union infantry surrendered these when they were attacked by Confederate cavalry. The only time the Confederates got in them was if they had artillery. Nasty things happen when an artillery shell goes off in one of these, as you can imagine. Or they scared the Union troops, because a lot of the troops guarding these were short-term guys they recruited in order to be able to free up the veterans they could send to the front. By and large, these were extremely successful in protecting bridges. So if you go forward, here's another design. You can see they're generally two-story with the lower story covered by dirt. That gives you supply down below. Sometimes they slept in tents outside of them and then would go in when the Confederates were there. Sometimes a second story would be put on at an angle, and you can see here so that you had fronts so you could protect the weaker corners. That's always your vulnerable point because you can't put any muskets and loopholes in the corners or rifles. Sometimes they even built these in the shape of a cross and then put artillery pieces on them. They're much larger if you continue. Now here's one in the field. This is a bridge. The engineers didn't build this bridge, but this is an example of one of the longer bridges. This one's over 700 feet long in Whiteside, Tennessee. There were 4 of the blockhouses that were built to protect this bridge on each quadrant, and this is an example of one that's being finished. It's actually 2-story. They've already put the dirt, you can see kind of sloped up there on the lower one, and the troops are camping. What would happen is the engineers would do most of the construction work, and then they'd leave and the infantry would come in behind, keep the dirt up, and then they would be the garrison. So they would be kind of inspired to do good work because they were going to have to rely on this thing to protect in case of attack. Next, please. Now, let's roll forward to fall of 1864. Sherman's taken Atlanta, and he's decided, I'm not staying in Atlanta, I'm going to Savannah. I'm going to march all the way across Georgia to the sea, and I'm going to rely on that fertile region that hadn't been touched by war yet to supply my troops. But he didn't want to leave anything behind in Atlanta that was going to be of any value, right? So who do you think he called upon to help tear everything up? Michigan engineers, right? So here's a party from the Michigan engineers in Atlanta in late October, early November, tearing up railroad line. And the reason they did that was the Confederates didn't have a single factory that could produce railroad line. They could produce the railroad iron. And so if you tore them up and you heated and twisted them, they didn't have any way to melt them down and reform them or to untwist them. So anything you destroyed permanently. So when you left Atlanta, you didn't leave them anything they were going to be able to use to reconstruct the railroad line in the rear. So next, please. Now, when they left Atlanta, they burned a lot of stuff. You've seen images of that. Some of it was public, some of it was private. Here's an account of Lieutenant Allen Campbell, who's in the engineers, of how he came face to face with that kind of moral choice of what to do. Most of the people left their houses without saying a word. They knew it would be useless to contend with the soldiers. But I was about to fire one place. A little girl, about 10 years old, came to me and said, "Mr. Soldier, you would not burn our house, would you? If you do, where are we going to live?" And she looked in my face with such a pleading look that I could not have the heart to fire the place, so I dropped the torch and walked away. If you'd go ahead, next one. Now, they marched to the sea. They went to Savannah. Now, here's a different version of things. This is his brother, Alex Campbell, who was a sergeant in the same company. He wrote this back home. Both of these letters were written at the same time to their father. "It's a dark time for Georgia, and long will she remember the time when Sherman's army or men marched through. But they have sown on the winds, and now they reap of the whirlwind." These are 2 guys that have been in service for 3 years, confronted by kind of that same moral dilemma and 2 different approaches to it. Now, when Sherman went from Atlanta to Savannah, he left behind a Confederate army in Alabama. He knew what they were going to do. They were going to go up into Tennessee and try to take Nashville. And so he left behind troops to be able to protect it. So the Confederates moved up that Nashville and Decatur Railroad to Columbia, got in a bloody battle at Franklin, and then eventually the Confederate forces were all around Nashville in December 1864. The 2 companies of engineers had been left behind. The other 10, now, there was a 12-company regiment now. The other 10 went with Sherman. 2 stayed behind in Tennessee. And they were in Murfreesboro. Remember that Fortress Rosecrans we talked about? Perfectly safe there. But there were some other detachments of Union troops strung along the railroad. And Murfreesboro, though it was large and defended, had never been really stocked with supplies. So the engineers and mechanics were part of a group that was loaded on a train in Murfreesboro and sent down to Stevenson, well south of the map, to resupply and bring supplies back up. Confederates were mostly in Nashville, but they had cavalry running up and down the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad trying to pick off Union detachments. So if you flip, please. December 15th, 1864. This is one of the most costliest fights the engineers were in. They were part of this train guard. The Confederates destroyed the track, and so they had to stop the train. The engineers got out. That's why they were there, was to repair track that had been destroyed or damaged. Repaired it, loaded back on, went to the next one, same problem. Then they get off. Then the Confederates are on their left or on their right. They destroy the track behind, and then they fire artillery shells and take out the engine. So they're about 6 miles south of Murfreesboro, and there's no reason to save this train. It's going nowhere. The engine's broke, the tracks broke north and south of it. So the officer in command of the infantry guard said, "Let's make a run for it." And so they did. And none of the engineers made it. None of the Tennessee cavalry with them, Union Tennessee. And most of the Illinois infantry got captured too. But enough survived to be able to say what happened. Here's a report about the engineers. "In justice to the 1st Michigan Engineers, allow me to say that they behaved themselves with firmness, and during the engagement they fought like veterans." None of these men had been in combat before. These were all relatively new recruits under a 21-year-old lieutenant. Leander Stillwell, a soldier in the Illinois troop who made it, said, "The Michigan Engineers can fight like tigers." Now, nobody knew what happened to these guys. They were captured, taken south. 4 died in captivity. 2 others died on the Sultana steamer that blew up at the end of the war. But they thought they were all killed because at that point in time, there was a whole lot of taking guys off in the woods and just shooting them going on. instead of prisoners. So Lieutenant Sly, this is son of the captain who died in the train incident, wrote home, "It makes my blood run cold to think of the probable fate of the 31 men who were captured." Next, please. Now, while this was going on back in Tennessee, Sherman was in Savannah resupplying his men, including those 10 companies of engineers, and then was going to march up through the Carolinas. So he marched all the way across Georgia, was going to drive up through the Carolinas, really destroy the last place the Confederates had much control over. This is Corporal Greenock describing the Carolinas. And it's important to remember, across the river from Savannah is South Carolina. And what started in South Carolina? The war with the firing on Sumter, right? And South Carolina was the first state to secede. It was considered to be the very core of the Confederacy that had caused so much death and destruction and so forth. So you can get a sense what's coming up for them. So here's Greenock talking about it. "I thought we'd use the country and people pretty rough coming through Georgia, but it was but a show compared to what was done to South Carolina. It was the general understanding through the entire army when it left Savannah that she would be made an example of, and I can say it, and carried out. There was nothing preserved." You know, when they talk about 60-mile wide swath of nothing but burning, that's what happened to South Carolina. So if you flip forward, just to hit a couple of highlights of work that they did. They left Savannah, they went up to Columbia. Some of you may recall Columbia was burned largely to the ground. It's a debate as to whether it was retreating Confederates burning cotton or Union troops coming in. The engineers were outside of it building pontoon bridges at the time, though some of them seem to have gotten in the city because they write home about things they liberated from South Carolinians, you know. Then they marched to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and that was important because there was a U.S. Armory there from before the war that had produced a lot of the weapons Confederates were using during the war. And so the engineers were given the assignment to knock it all down, and they completely destroyed U.S. arsenal. They lost one man. It's a real sad story. His name's Joseph Kennedy. He enlisted as a 44-year-old, according to his record. He was probably more like 46 or 47. When the war started, in the fall of 1861, he's one of the very few original men left in the regiment. I think the only one who was in his 40s who was still left, and was in charge of one of the destruction parties, and a wall fell on him. Killed him instantly, left behind a widow and 7 children back in Michigan. And then they marched to Raleigh, where they were joined by the 2 companies from Tennessee. They were given supplies. And this is the point at which Lee's army is brought to bay at Appomattox. So if you flip to the next one. And this happens. And that's what I wanted to talk just a little bit about real quickly tonight. And that's the death of President Lincoln. After Lee surrendered, there was still that Confederate army in North Carolina commanded by Joseph Johnston. And he and Sherman were negotiating, arguing what the terms were going to be back and forth. And so even though the war was still going, the engineers were in camp waiting. They knew it was going to turn out right. They were starting to see the end of the war. They're starting to think about home. And then they get this thunderbolt and this news. They voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln in the 1864 election. They identified him as their commander-in-chief. All that emotional attachment to it. And then he's killed there at the end. Here's Corporal Greenock. "I never have for the last 3 years felt the sorrow and grief that I do at present. If by my staying in the service another year I replace Mr. Lincoln back again, I would cheerfully stay." This is a guy who's already served more than 3 years. "The news is awful to think of. It renders the army frantic for revenge." Simeon Howe. "If Johnston hadn't surrendered and these men had set out, it would have been bloodbath." There was that deep a feeling. There's a report in another letter from an engineer. The one man who didn't think much of Lincoln said, "Hooray, the dictator is dead," and they beat him to death. It was a Union soldier. You see other accounts from other regiments. This isn't unique to these. Could you flip, please? Sorry, I didn't telegraph on that one. So Johnston surrenders. The engineers, along with Sherman's army, march to Washington. They have the big parade. You've seen pictures of it. The engineers were in that, and they're in camps. And then the war's over. I've done my bit. I signed up to save the Union. We've saved it. When am I going home? When am I going home? That's all they're talking about. Private Leach, "My love to all my little children. Tell them Father will be home soon." Private Sterling, "The first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. We have all got this home on the brain, the home in the heart, and home we will come." Well, that was May of 1865. They got orders to load up on the trains and get all their gear, and they sent them to Louisville, Kentucky, instead of back home to Michigan. And they worked on fortifications that everybody knew wasn't going to need to be used. And some of them started to, well, let's just say leave the army on their own accord. You had almost 50 of them desert in the course of that and said, "Heck with this, I'm going home." Later, things were cleared up. And then they were all organized, loaded up on the train and said, "Okay, get your stuff together." And then they went to Nashville, so they're going the wrong direction. So it wasn't until September 1865 that the last of the regiment was mustered out. There were still about 100 guys who were original recruits to the regiment. Many of them were among the officer corps. So here's one account. This is Isaac Roseberry, enlisted November 61, and this is when he arrived home November 65. We are now again citizens of the United States, the country we helped to save with lives and blood, composed of the flower of the country. I reached home more dead than alive. He recovered and lived another 40 years, and his diary is one of the best ones for research in the regiment. Well, anyway, that's their story, that's their war. I hope I added. Whoa.
Next one's black.
That's usually the time.
Those of you who are descendants, can you raise your hand of the regiment? There's a couple here, right? That's right. Very good. Very good. Matter of fact, your great-great-grandfather's in the book, and we held up the picture, and he looks just like him. There you go. Great, great. Any questions, please?
Yes, sir.
All of their work and all their trestles have long since gone and rotted away. But as we look at the Elk River Bridge and those 4 pylons, I would ask, are there any pylons left that you came across in your searches that may have at one time held a bridge that the 1st Michigan built and used them to support?
Yes, I believe there are. I can't prove it. They aren't columns as tall as that anymore. They're fairly low, and you see them below water. I've seen pictures of them. When I was most recently in Tennessee, I had a chance to spend the day with a local historian, and he told me that not that many years ago, during an unusually dry summer, they'd actually seen 4 feet going across, all of them 4 feet going across, and they were pretty sure it was of the wartime era. Certainly after the war, they would have used the same abutments, so that makes sense. A lot of the crossings are at the same places, and so you can really, and they're in the middle of nowhere still in a lot of cases. So it's might be a 1940s metal bridge, but you can really visualize in a sense. You can tell where there would have been some more challenges because of the way the river bends or something. So that's still there. And then a lot of the towns are still very similar. They were on what was then the highway. It was the Pike Road and then the railroad. They often ran parallel. They'd come together in these towns. And so some of the depots still remain. You have houses that still remain. In Perryville, there's a house right off the battlefield where one of the engineers died. He was mortally wounded in the fighting. Still there. So there's that kind of structure too. There's also like the depot in Huntsville is still there. That Captain Yates at the time ran that railroad from that depot. And there's a letter written by a soldier looking out the window describing the scene, and it's not changed a whole lot. Other than you got telegraph lines and stuff. So there's that you can still look at. And the battlefield, some of them are still large intact. Laverne, I was sitting there trying to pick which convenience store they were at, in terms of the spot, but several of the other places are still very similar. Like the crossing at Elk River.
But those pylons, they're long gone.
I believe there's still some that are Civil War era, and probably were what they worked on. Some of the smaller
That'd be kind of
houses.
cool to identify them,
Yeah, you stand there and you know what's there, you're looking at the picture, and you get that special feeling, but it's a different looking spot in some ways. Yes, ma'am.
You'll think this is the silliest question.
No, I won't.
I'm not engineer-minded. And you started out talking about trains and engineers. And then it got into these men designing things and building them. So what is the difference between a train engineer and a mechanical engineer or whatever type engineer you would term these men?
When you use the word train engineer, it usually means the person driving the train up front.
Yes, that's
And sometimes they did that, but most of the work they did was civil engineering, roads, bridges, railroads. And so they would be called a railroad engineer because they built railroads and they designed railroads, as opposed to a train engineer who's sitting up in the front of the engine, who's driving it technically down the track. Yeah, it's confusing. I've struggled with how to use the word. There are other words they use besides engineer, but that's by and large the one people understand because civil engineering is still, very much obviously a very important profession, and it's what they use the most of the day.
So it sounds like none of them survived to return home.
Yeah, they did actually.
Well, they did.
Yeah.
Then when they got home, let's say they came home to Detroit,
Yep.
Would they have built a building?
Yeah, there's a school in Marshall, built by one of these as a contractor, that still stands. There are wooden structures that they may have been involved in the late 1800s. I believe there were several of them were builders, they were contractors. Others of them worked on railroads. A lot went into the lumber business, as you'd expect. And so some of them owned the mills that cut the lumber up. Others of them were out in the woods identifying timber to be taken down.
Well, then, I have recently seen, I've been in the GAR
Yeah.
castle down.
Yeah, Grand Detroit.
So, that was built in 1899, and it was built to house Civil War veterans of
Yep.
Detroit and Michigan.
Yep.
Not to house them
Yep.
as a meeting.
For their meeting point, yes.
So would any of those engineers have taken a part in building the GAR?
They might have. Several of the men who came back were active in the Detroit community. The regiment was tended to be recruited more out of state. So there's places in Grand Rapids that were buildings that were very involved in it that still survive to this day. In Marshall, in Jackson, in Hastings, Ionia, Kalamazoo, those towns. There's less in Detroit because few of the officers came from Detroit. But there were several who were involved in the GAR at the time the castle was built. And so when they talk about the dedication ceremony, some of the people they'll reference as having been there were men from the engineers. There also are some other GAR halls that survive. I belong to a group called Sons of Union Veterans. We meet in the GAR hall in a little town called Sunfield outside of Lansing that was built in the 1890s. And one of the people who signed the design of it was someone who served in the engineers. And every meeting I sit in the chair with his name on it, because they let me. But so there are those very tangible physical connections with them from after the war.
Is this related in your book?
No. I didn't do a lot about post-war. I would have loved to have. And the press said, come on, we got to sell this as a book, not a war style. So,
Thank you.
yes, thank you. Great question.
Any other questions? By the way, go ahead. Two more questions, because you've got a 2-hour drive home, and let's try to keep them from taking all these books home. So I hope we're going to autograph some books for you.
I haven't finished your book, I've been working on it for a while, but total casualties, what are we looking at out of enlistments?
Isn't that Regiment?
About 3,100 served, depends who all you count. There's about 360 that died during the war. There's probably 50 that died within months of getting home, which I would count as wartime deaths. They just didn't recover. You're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 3,100. And then you've got the ones who lived but weren't the same. And so you start looking at the pension files, and emotionally never the same, physically never the same, large number of suicide. You know, the book that should be written is PTSD after the Civil War. There's a ton of evidence in pension files. And so certainly it affected almost everyone. But in terms of death, wartime deaths, I would say about 400 is a fair figure out of 31.
Oh, you had that one slide of one of the wooden trestles, and over in the right-hand corner, looked like there was an earth embankment.
Yes.
And you said that sometimes they just covered the wooden trestle, maybe filled it in with dirt.
If I said that, I wasn't right. I didn't describe it well. What they've done since that time is bring in a lot of dirt and then replace the bridging, the trestling, with earthen embankments.
Right.
Yeah, they didn't. They took out the embankment and then replaced it with dirt. But that was late 1800s, early 1900s in a lot of cases.
And it might have become a permanent, more or less, it was a permanent railroad, perhaps down in the south.
Yeah, you're driving along this railroad and you're staring up at it much of the time, the National Northwestern now.
Yeah, I was in North Carolina recently, and I looked at this abandoned track. It was used up until the 50s, and it was this huge embankment.
Yeah.
I thought, how did they do that? They must have brought a bunch of prisoners in or something.
Well, back then it was easier to build trestle than move that much dirt. Later, when you got mechanized, then it was easier and cheaper to bring in dirt than to build the wood. Especially this is wartime, they just had to get it to last a few years.
One last thing, I'm sorry if I don't mind me asking a question. Isaac Rosen, was it? It was, so this was
Isaac Roseberry.
Roseberry, so this was Jewish too, I mean, this would have been.
I'm not sure he was
Maybe I
Jewish,
don't
I've
know.
always
Okay.
wondered. There are identified Jewish soldiers from Michigan.
Mhm.
There's a book written in the 1960s.
Yes,
by
I got a
Scott.
copy of it.
There's a larger version of that that talks about Union soldiers. Roseberry's a common German name.
Okay.
And a lot of Jewish names, Yiddish, German, it's sometimes a little difficult to sort out. In my own line, we've got a question in Germany about Jewish or not Jewish for much the same reason.
Okay.
Were all the companies of the regiment at the Grand Review? Do you know that?
Yes, but not all the men were.
Well,
Yeah,
obviously, but
all
the
12 companies were part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what, that was again, what year?
It was summer.
The Grand Review, oh, they did them all the
That
time.
was,
No,
well, this
summer
was,
65.
this was the big one. It was May
Okay.
3 and 24, or 24 and 25,
Oh, I see,
1865.
okay.
One day was the Army of the Potomac, next day was Sherman's, and the engineers were in it. Some guys were left in camp, some were sick, some were back still in Savannah, some were in Tennessee, but all 12 companies marched. So if your ancestor was healthy and there then, he would have been in the review.
That's what I thought.
I found a few bummed out guys who got left back in camp to guard things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that kind of thing always happens,
Yeah, yeah, very good. Hey, thank you again.
Thank you very much.